and I now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Ivey, for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Judd, let me start with you. I believe on page 3 of your testimony, you talk about the need for recruitment and retention of agents and the challenge of lacking pay parity. Would it make sense for additional funds to be made available to you and your agents so that you can recruit and retain more agents so they can do the work?
It's vitally important.
All right. And then with respect to the funding, you mentioned in the paragraph just above that that there was an increase of 2,700. I guess this is a proposal that will require 2 challenges. One is to have and recruit more agents, but that entails having additional funding to recruit them, right?
It does, yes.
Yeah, and in fact, right now there's a national competition for agents, police officers, and the like. There's shortages everywhere across the country, so there's competition based in part on increasing salaries and then sometimes offering bonuses for people to sign up so we can attract them. Isn't that correct? All right, so having additional funding for recruiting and retaining officers would be important.
It would. In fact, I submitted that to DHS, and I heard nothing back from DHS. Man, what we saw was anything what we were hoping for in any budget request from this administration.
All right, you mean the new budget?
Yes.
Okay, so additional funding on top of that would be important and useful.
Absolutely.
All right, and so you would ask Congress to provide additional funding potentially to help address that need?
Absolutely.
All right, and then let me ask Mr. Stauber. Actually, I guess I can ask both of you. I'm sorry, Mr. Judd and Mr. Quinn. You both testified about the length of the border. I guess, Mr. Judd, you talked about it more. Mr. Quinn, you mentioned that you have a shorter border with Canada from New Hampshire. But with respect to you, Mr. Judd, you mentioned that, 5,500 plus miles of border?
Yes, sir.
All right, and then while you were working on the border, I think you said you had to cover, was it 275 miles of border by yourself?
No, sir. I had to, the most that I ever covered at one time was 60 miles.
60 miles, okay. Is that bigger than it should be from your perspective?
It's to properly patrol the border on the northern border with as little technology as we have, you would need 1 agent for every 3 to 5 miles. 1 agent to every 30 to 60 miles just isn't going to do it.
All right, so increasing the number of agents would be helpful, even
Absolutely.
if we don't get to 1 per 3 miles.
Absolutely.
More agents would be helpful.
Yes, sir.
And more funding so that we can hire more agents would be necessary for that to happen. And then Commissioner Quinn, let me ask you about Operation Stone Garden. This is a FEMA-funded or managed program?
Yes, sir. Started in 2011, Operation Stone Garden.
Okay, and you mentioned in your testimony that I guess there was a request, I don't know if it was just by you, but an effort to get additional funding for Operation Stone Garden?
Yes, and those funds go to a collaborative local, state, county officers that work together along the border to support CBP.
Okay, and the additional funding would be useful so that maybe you could hire more officers and do more to cover these the border as well?
Well, actually, the funding would be for more patrols and specifically 3 all-terrain vehicles. That's what we had requested and was denied.
All right, all right. So more funding would be helpful.
Yes, sir.
All right. With respect to Representative Tenney's comments at the end of her testimony, she invited me to join in co-sponsoring her bill, which is HR 9023. And the reason I pointed out is problematic, and apparently she agrees, is it only references the southern border. But the additional problem I have with the bill, and the reason I wouldn't co-sponsor it at this point, is it contains no funding source. So it calls for increasing salaries and expenses for new agents and officers, but it doesn't talk about how to pay for that other than the monopoly money approach of trying to get it from the Inflation Reduction Act, which I think we all know isn't going to happen. So I would join with your calls and the previous panel's calls to get additional funding. Stop playing games with the issue about who struck John or who caused it first. That's fine. We can do that for purposes of this hearing. But if we're going to be serious about it, and Mr. Judd, Mr. Quinn, I think your testimony reflects that, as does some of the other information we presented, a lot more funding is going to be necessary. And I'm calling on my Republican colleagues to come up with proposals to do that. So with that, I yield back, Your Honor, Mr. Chairman.
I can tell where you've been, sir.
Flashback.
I have the same predilection.